All right, today we're going to take a look at how the war erupted. It's the beginning chapter of chapter 6, or the beginning section, sorry, of chapter 16. And 16 takes a look at how the Civil War begins. And throughout the chapter, the main objective of this whole thing is that by the time we're done, you will understand how the Civil War began. We'll take a look at its progress during the early years and the impact that it had on Union and Confederate soldiers. I actually flipped one here too quick, but so today we're going to start with how the war erupted, and we'll look at how the fighting began at Fort Sumter. We'll talk about we'll analyze the strengths and the weaknesses of each side, and take a look at each side's strategy, and we'll also study at the very end the first Battle of Bull Run. But before we get going, I want to read you one American story, and it's centered around this lady right here, Emma Holmes. And it says, 2 months before the Civil War broke out, 22-year-old Emma Holmes of Charleston began keeping a detailed diary. Like other South Carolinians, Holmes got caught up in the passions that led her state to secede. From a rooftop, she witnessed the event that started the war. She wrote about South Carolina's attack on Fort Sumter, a federal fort in Charleston's harbor, which was in her diary. She goes, "At 4:30 this morning, the heavy booming of cannons woke the city from its slumbers. Everybody seems relieved that what has been so long dreaded has come at last, and so confident of victory that they seem not to think of the danger of their friends. I had a splendid view of the harbor with the naked eye. We could distinctly see flames amidst the smoke. All the barracks were on fire, and with the telescope I saw the shots as they struck the fort and saw the masonry crumbling." A lot of Southerners actually expected a pretty short war that they would have easily won. Northerners actually expected the same thing, so in this section today we're going to take a look at how a war started, how the states divided, and how each side planned to win. Now, as they seceded from the Union, the southern states took over most of the federal forts inside their borders. President Abraham Lincoln had to decide what to do about the forts that remained under federal control. Major Robert Anderson and his garrison held on to Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, but they were running out of supplies. If Lincoln supplied the garrison, he risked war. If he ordered the troops to leave the fort, he would be giving in to the rebels. So Lincoln informed South Carolina that he was sending supply ships to Fort Sumter, and leaders of the Confederacy, which was the nation that was formed by the southern states, they decided to prevent the federal government from holding onto the fort by attacking before the supply ships could even get there. So at 4:30 on April 12th of 1861, shore guns opened fire on the island fort, and for 34 hours the Confederates fired shells into the fort until Anderson was forced to surrender. No one was killed, but the South's attack on Fort Sumter was the beginning of the Civil War. Now, 2 days after the surrender of Fort Sumter, President Lincoln asked the Union states to provide 75,000 militiamen for 90 days to put down the uprising in the South. Citizens of the North responded with enthusiasm to the call to arms. A New York woman wrote, "It seems as if we never were alive till now, never had a country till now." In the Upper South, however, state leaders responded with anger. The governor of Kentucky said that the state would furnish no troops for the wicked purpose of subduing her sister southern states. In the weeks that followed, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas all voted to join the Confederacy. As each state seceded, volunteers rushed to enlist just as citizens did in the North. A young Arkansas enlistee wrote, "So impatient did I become for starting that I felt like 10,000 pins were pricking me in every part of the body, and started off a week in advance of my brothers. Some feared the war would never be over some feared the war would actually be over, before they got the chance to fight." With Virginia on its side, the Confederacy had a much better chance for victory. Virginia was very wealthy and it was very populous, and it was also part of the Confederacy, and in 1861 they moved the capital to Richmond, Virginia. Now, Richmond was also the home of Robert E. Lee, a very talented military leader. When Virginia seceded, Lee resigned from the United States Army and joined the Confederacy. Even though Lee did oppose slavery and secession, he explained, "I cannot raise my hand against my birthplace, my home, my children." He eventually became the commanding general of the Army of Northern Virginia. So after Virginia seceded, both sides knew that the border states would play a very key role in the war's outcome. The border states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri were slave states that bordered states in which slavery was illegal. Because of their location and resources, the border states could tip the scales toward one side. So keeping Maryland in the Union was very, very important for the North, because if Maryland seceded, then Washington, D.C. would be cut off from the Union. Obviously, D.C. is the capital. So to hold on to the state, Lincoln considered arresting Maryland lawmakers who backed the South, but he decided against it. Pro-Union leaders eventually gained control of the Maryland legislature, and the state stayed in the Union. Kentucky was also important to both sides because of its rivers. For the Union, the rivers could provide an invasion route into the South, and for the South, the rivers could provide a barrier. Kentuckians were deeply divided over secession. However, a Confederate invasion in 1861 prompted the state to stay in the Union. Both Missouri and Delaware also stayed in the Union. In Virginia, federal troops helped a group of western counties break away. These counties formed the state of West Virginia and returned to the Union. So in the end, we had 24 states that belonged to the Union and 11 that joined and belonged to the Confederacy. So the Union had huge advantages in manpower and resources. The North had about 22 million people, while the Confederacy had only about 9 million, and actually 3.5 of those 9 million were slaves. About 85% of the nation's factories were located in the North. The North had more than double the railroad mileage of the South, and almost all the naval power and shipyards also belonged to the North. The Union's greatest asset, however, was President Lincoln. He was quite the leader and developed into an even better leader during the war. He was able to convince Northerners that democracy depended on preserving the Union. The Confederacy had some advantages too. It began the war with pretty good generals like Robert E. Lee. It also had the advantage of fighting a defensive war, which meant that Northern supply lines would have to be stretched very far. In addition, soldiers defending their homes had more will to fight, and they were also defending their own way of life. So initially, the Confederate strategy was to take a defensive position. They did not want to conquer the North, they only wanted to be independent. "All we ask is to be let alone," said Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Confederate leaders hoped the North would soon tire of the war and accept Southern independence. The South also depended on King Cotton as a way to win foreign support. Cotton was king because Southern cotton was important in the world market. The South grew most of the cotton for Europe's textile mills, and when the war broke out, Southern planters withheld cotton from the market, hoping to force France and Britain to aid the Confederate cause. But it happened so in 1861 that European nations actually had a surplus of cotton because of a big crop the year before, and they did not want to get involved in the American war, so therefore they did not buy cotton. Now, as the war heated up, the South soon moved away from its cautious plans, and it began to take the offensive and try for some big victories to wreck Northern morale. Now, in the Union, they wanted to bring the Southern states back into their Union. So to do this, the North developed an offensive strategy based on General Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan. The plan was designed to smother the South's economy like a giant anaconda snake squeezing its prey. The plan called for a naval blockade off the South's coastline. So in a blockade, armed forces prevent the transportation of goods or people into or out of an area, and the plan also called for the Union to gain control of the Mississippi River, which would split the Confederacy in two. One of the drawbacks of Scott's plans was that it would take time to work, but many people eager for action were calling for an immediate attack on Richmond, the Confederate capital, so Lincoln ordered an invasion of Virginia in the summer of 1861. So in order to take Richmond, the Union Army would first have to defeat the Confederate troops stationed at the town of Manassas, Virginia. This was a railway center southwest of Washington, D.C. On July 21st of 1861, Union forces commanded by General Irvin McDowell clashed with Confederate forces headed by General Pierre Beauregard near a little creek called Bull Run, north of Manassas. In the north, this battle came to be known as the First Battle of Bull Run. At one point in the battle, a Confederate officer rallied his troops by pointing his sword toward Southern General Thomas J. Jackson, and the officer cried, there is Jackson standing like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians." From this incident, Jackson won the nickname Stonewall Jackson. His men held fast against the Union assault. So as fresh troops arrived, the Confederates equaled the Union forces in numbers, and they launched a countercharge. Attacking the Union line, they let out a blood-curdling scream which came to later be known as the Rebel Yell. It caused the Union troops to panic and freak out, and they broke their ranks and they scattered. The Confederate victory in the First Battle of Bull Run thrilled the South, and it shocked the North. Many in the South thought the war was won, and the North realized that they had vastly underestimated their opponent. Lincoln then sent the 90-day militias home, and he called for a real army of 500,000, 500,000 volunteers for 3 years. So in section 2, we will take a look at what army life was like for these soldiers.